Hi all, welcome to Module 3. This week we're talking about power, domination, and resistance as they relate to conflict. So last week we were talking about conflict framing, which is how people use language to define important aspects of the conflict, like what's at stake, what the people involved are like, and what kind of actions are appropriate. But this week we're looking at power, which is also something we enact through our communication, sort of like the framing. And power is especially evident when we're in conflict. So in this brief video, I'll highlight a few important ideas about power and then talk about why they matter in conflict situations. And I'll kind of end with an example that demonstrates some of the things we're talking about. So first, let's talk about what is power and where does it come from. A very basic definition of power is that it's the ability to influence or control the behavior of others. People can draw their power from several different sources. And these are talked about more fully in your readings for the week, but I think they're useful to think through a little bit here. So one source of power is clearly from somebody's position, like their legitimate authority, the role that they have in the context. So a position of power could be something like a supervisor in the workplace, a teacher if you're in a school environment, a political leader, maybe a parent if you're in the family context, right? So the position gives the person some sort of authority and the ability to influence others. There's also a type of power that comes from the ability to reward and punish others. Sometimes this coincides with positional power because obviously, like your boss has the ability to give and deny a pay raise, decide who gets to work on certain projects, etc. But it doesn't always have to come with legitimate authority. Sometimes the ability to reward and punish others isn't related to your position, right? You can think about like a bully. Even without formal authority, they can make your life really miserable, right? So they have the ability to punish in that way. So a very different type of source of power comes from knowledge or expertise. So even without having an official supervisory role or without like threatening to punish or reward people, you can have a source of power if you have key information that is necessary in a situation. So just as a family example, a child or a young teen might be not kind of power down in the sort of formal roles of the family, but they might have knowledge about how to fix or use a technology that the parents can't figure out. And so that knowledge gives the kid some sort of power. At work, you might know the history of a problem or know specific information about a situation that can help resolve a conflict. So those are examples of sort of expertise or knowledge as a source of power. Finally, relationships. A very different source of power can come from the connections that we have with other people. So friendship and connection exert some influence over us. This isn't necessarily a negative thing, but think about how we're more likely to say yes to a request from a friend or a loved one than that same request from someone we don't know as well. This kind of power can be really meaningful in a conflict situation. People can take sides based on friendship relationships, or we might feel extra strong emotions because of our relationships if we're involved with somebody who we're close to, if we're involved in conflict with someone we're close to, right? So we all have access to these different sources of power in different aspects of our lives. What matters in a conflict situation, though, is that we tend to use the power that's available to us. Now, in an organizational context, well, actually in all contexts, but it's especially evident in an organizational context, that power is not equally distributed to everybody, right? Some people have access to certain kinds of power much more easily than others. And the power dynamics in a conflict can really shape what happens, how the conflict sort of builds and is expressed, how it's framed, how it's managed, and so on. So these kind of sources of power give us a really kind of fundamental understanding of what it is, but a more nuanced or sophisticated understanding of power shows that it's not something that people have individually, it's something that exists between us. It's between people, and it's fluid, which means that the distribution of power and the use of power can shift and flow throughout a conflict, throughout any interaction, but a conflict in particular. So it's easy to think about power as something that some people have and other people don't, right? Oh, my boss has power. I don't have any power in this situation because he's my boss, right? But that's not really accurate to how power works. So power being between people means it really only operates when people are in relationship to each other. Like if we're completely by ourselves, we don't think about the need to exert influence or control others, right? Because we're just isolated. It's only the fact that we exist in connection, in relationship, that power is ever manifested. And power is also sort of fluid, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this little area. Certainly people have access to different bases or sources of power, right? But the way that power is enacted in particular moments can really change throughout a conflict. You can probably think about arguments you've been in where you felt like you were really kind of winning and then something changed and then you were like, oh, I'm not winning anymore, or they pulled some sort of trump card or whatever that made it so that now I feel like I'm kind of in the power down situation. So it shifts and changes throughout our moment to moment experience. Because this is a class thinking about organizational context, it's also really important to highlight the fact that organizational structures support unequal power distributions. So some people have easier access to bases of power, sources of power by virtue of their position, right? We think about hierarchies, kind of supervisory roles. Clearly that sort of positional power is very evident in organizational context, and that makes a big difference in the way that we engage in conflict, right? If you engage in a conflict with your colleague or your coworker, it's really different than expressing dissent or disagreement with your boss, right? But other people can have access to power just by virtue of their relationships or kind of parts of their identity. So you might have a group of guys who all go golfing together with the boss, or people go out to drinks afterwards, or maybe certain kinds of people are always the people who get promoted in an organization, and other kinds of people, by virtue of some aspect of their identity, are not given access to those power situations, right? So it's important to think about power not just as like an individual or in relation, but something that is embedded into our structures that support our lives. So although power is fluid and can shift, it's definitely not equally distributed. And in a conflict situation, sometimes these inequities become very, very evident and can appear to be really central to what's going on in the conflict. So what does all this sort of situation and stuff about power mean for looking at a conflict in particular? Well, power is especially evident in things like contract negotiations and bargaining situations, or in sort of mediation, where you got people at a table, there's a third party kind of mediator, and they're back and forth trying to fix a conflict situation. Power is clearly evident there, right? But all conflicts involve power, whether it's power struggles between people, like I was sort of talking about, in this sort of fluid back and forth, somebody trying to exert power over somebody else, you got to do what I say, or people trying to resist power. It's conflict kind of highlights the power dynamics in all of those ways. So recognizing those power dynamics can help us take a critical look at conflict and move toward a more full understanding of what's happening, and that can help us figure out how to mitigate or manage conflict effectively. So power is a really important lens for looking at interactions, and especially conflict interactions. So two kind of concepts that are embedded in this are domination and resistance. So power domination is basically power over. Somebody, maybe they're supported by all these structures trying to exert power over other people. I'm the boss, I'm trying to get you to do what I say. Or maybe I'm not the boss, but I'm going to use my other bases of power, like my office cliques and the people who support me, or maybe the dirt I know on you, right? And I'm going to try to use that to make you do what I want. I'm going to exert my power in that way. That's a sense of domination, right? Harassment, bullying, all sorts of stuff like that can be examples of domination. So we can see this in interpersonal situations, and you can also see it in, if you look up, just look up online, the idea of a toxic boss or toxic leadership. You can see that power over domination is a really big part of what we think of as sort of toxic leadership there. So when people are approached or kind of encounter this sort of domination, there's lots of different ways to respond, right? But one way is to resist. And so resistance and domination, resistance and sort of power over are these two sides of a coin, right? So resistance is a way to push back against domination. It can start with a simple act of saying no. No, I won't do that. No, I don't believe that. No, I'm not going to go along with this, right? It can be dissent, like individual dissent. This policy, I think, is unfair, right? Or this thing that is happening right now is not okay, which can then be the sort of the first step of conflict. If we think conflict is an expressed struggle, this resistance can often be the first expression of that struggle. Resistance can also be collective, where it's not just a single person engaging in saying no to a boss or no to a colleague, no to a family member who they're having a conflict with, but it can be a way of organizing a whole group of people against the source of domination that they are experiencing. And so some of the readings that we have for this week deal with that a little bit. So resistance isn't the same thing as disagreeing. There's some overlap. Disagreeing is a much broader category, but resistance is explicitly focused on pushing back against the assertion of power over. Okay, so let's look at a quick example. When I was in my 20s, I was kind of outdoorsy. I worked at this small outdoor recreation program, and I was one of 4 team leaders. It was a pretty small organization. And these team leaders, we'd been there for a few years. We were, we each had our own little kind of team that we were managing. We were pretty competent at what we were doing, or we believed that we were. I think we probably were. And we were used to a supervisor, the director of the organization, who was really hands-off and very empowering, right? Because power can also be the kind of thing that you share and you give and you build people up. Well, that director moved on to something else. We got a new director, and he had a really different approach. This new director, I'm going to call him Tim, he was very micromanaging, and he wanted lots of individual meetings with these team leaders, and he wanted us to ask him permission for every decision so that he would be in the loop, right? And he would often come up with these tasks that he needed us to do, kind of these administrative tasks that to us seemed just like really inconsistent with our normal jobs, just like extra meaningless kind of stuff, and we really didn't like it. And we expressed our concerns about all this additional work that took us away from what we thought we were supposed to do, and also frustration that he didn't trust us to do our jobs, but he didn't want to hear about it because that was not kind of what he wanted to do. He had positional power and reward power, and so we felt kind of trapped, right? But then one of my colleagues, one of the other team supervisors, noticed that Tim was very distractible, right? That he would get excited about big projects, like new services we could potentially offer. And he also, since he's an outdoor company, right? He liked to talk about the trips that he'd been on and cool places he'd been, and then think about like what that might mean for us later. So we used that piece of information to our advantage, right? We kind of organized collectively, and we got in the habit of changing the subject to something like that when we felt like he was exerting power over and being too micromanaging. So among ourselves, we referred to this as jangling something shiny to distract Tim. And sometimes at meetings, one of my colleagues would even like physically pick up his keys and jangle them a little bit as a signal to the rest of us when he thought Tim was getting too out of hand. It was just an inside joke, but we kind of organized around it. So to analyze that, we were using our relationships, our sort of relational power with each other to organize resistance collectively against our boss who had positional and reward power over us. And it worked for a while, and we were able to mitigate some of the micromanaging. But as you might expect, it turns out that's really not the best way to address a conflict, right? And it's not the best way to solve a problem. And when he figured out what we're doing, he got pretty angry, right? So then we had to have more of a difficult and honest conflict management process. So now I'm not in my 20s anymore. I've learned a lot since then, and I don't really recommend this sort of like trick the boss strategy as a way to manage conflict. But at the time, that was the resource that we thought we had available to us. So the example shows how people draw power from different sources, how power shifts through the conflict situation, and how people can organize for resistance. So that's it for now. In this module, you'll have an opportunity to talk about some of these ideas as they apply to your own examples or an example that I've provided. I hope that this is helpful for you, and I look forward to reading your reflections. Thanks.